make it political capital for political peace for a while. If you're interested in a larger project, something sustainable, somebody, and I'm comfortable doing it, I'm happy to do it, somebody's got to go in and have these conversations. Someone has to normalize this kind of activity, these kinds of conversations. And maybe people would be nervous about those conversations, that's fine. But I think, you know, people who aren't nervous about them should go ahead and do them. There's really solely
Well, in sort of this similar idea of how transportable is this, or whether or not the exact format is transportable, the applications of this kind of an idea, I'm thinking about in this country, especially to gangland areas, underclass areas and stuff. One of the things that seems to come up to me, and I'm going to ask about this in Northern Ireland, you talk about this being working class neighborhood, and I'm wondering if that's a misnomer. Are they really, I mean, what's the employment rate or the unemployment rate in these areas? Is it a misnomer? So it's similar in some ways to some underclass areas in this country. So are there programs coupled with any of this that help preparedness for any kind of entry into society or social structures?
No, and that of course is, you know, a significant critique of any kind of effort. It's doing something. I've got 540 kids that haven't been beaten or shot, but I also have nothing for 540 kids to do, essentially. I have nothing for young men to do in Northern Ireland who aspire to be military men, like their fathers and their uncles and even their brothers. And if they're sitting around in bars all day or doing dope all day, and they're unemployed at rates in some of these communities over 70%, there's a real question about if you can create a sustainable peace with that. And in South Africa, he's going to teach us an awful lot. Because while it's wildly heralded as a successful peace deal, the class issues, I approach everything that way, by nature, I think, by DNA, the structural approach to things. And Northern Ireland, for me, still, after all these years, has always been a class proposition. What goes on there. I was telling my buddies on all sides this issue, I talk about it all the time, that while they may have shot at each other during the war, they have far more in common than they have difference. And their biggest enemies, and this is not a Republican or a loyalist, their biggest enemies are working class Catholics, or excuse me, middle class Catholics and middle class Protestants and Unionists. Those are their biggest. So I'm talking about certainly underclass areas here. And another problem, and this I have more of an impact with some organizations, has been, okay, our reconciliation programs. I won't be critical of any of them. That is, the NGOs that come into an area, kind of put the money in, hundreds of millions of pounds flow into Northern Ireland as part of the peace deal. And the question becomes, okay, how much of that contributes to the sustainable peace? We set up organizations, it does important things, but how about the tough nut now? What about employment? What about education, particularly for Protestants, which is much more deficient than parochial educations that Catholics have got in Northern Ireland? And, you know, how do we address these kinds of issues? These are probably the core issues of a sustainable peace, is what we all know to be some vesting in a peaceful society. You're vested with a job, the normalization of society, a consensus on what is justice going to be. These are ways you vest people in a society. You have an awfully hard time, as you do in this country, making a pitch to young people to behave a certain way, the way we desire them to behave, but they're not vested in that way of life at all. There's nothing for them in that.
So is there a struggle to get out of those communities? Or is there, it doesn't sound like it's the similar struggle to get out of those communities as there is to get out of the underclass communities here.
Yeah, I don't know what that means, getting out of. It's more transforming the communities. I mean, select individuals.
See individuals, if they see an aspiration struggle, it's like, we got to get out of here.
That's fine, and I think that works well for individuals, but when we're talking about, you know, groups of people that are kind of wired in a history of being underclass, it's a very different proposition. It's transforming that place. But for people that come in with all the money, with the NGOs, with the foundations and philanthropies and the trusts, to understand that their reconciliation portfolio needs to change. Okay? You know, they can have all these kind of nice justice programs and the kumbaya programs and all that, and I don't mean to demean that stuff. It has a role at some point. But employment programs, you know, actual jobs kind of stuff, not the computer courses. Places flooded with those. You know, and then do what? You know, get a bunch of computers and train people how to use them, and then there's nothing. You know, these are real issues. So how do you improve that kind of quality of life? How do you get more counseling services that these kids need? That's a huge struggle. The infrastructure in the community is very, very low. And so how do you take communities with very low infrastructure and develop them? That's a peace project, I think. Not only there, in conflict areas, but here as well. I mean, we haven't declared war against each other. It'd be a lot easier to look at U.S. violence rates and say, oh, well, we have this ongoing civil war. You know, and that would normalize it for us. We don't have that luxury. 9 out of 10 young people, you know, 15 to 25 who are killed in the top 20 industrialized countries in the world die here. 90% of all those kids die in the United States with no war. But I think our long-term peace project involves a lot of those same kinds of infrastructure issues as well. It can't be divorced from that. You know. Yes, go ahead.
I was going to, reflecting on the class issue for a second, and this gets more to your, maybe your work with NAPCAM than it does with your Northern Ireland work, but it strikes me that there is a certain type of person or certain types of people, certain classes of people that are attracted to the work that we do. And in shorthand, you probably could sell a lot more Windham Hill CDs than Iron Maiden CDs at a mediation conference. Ed Sachs, who just left, is probably the only person who spent time in prison for a violent offense in our group. So, when you talk about community mediation, we're so divorced from so many of, culturally as a group, from so many of the communities that might benefit from something like this. Is it even a misnomer for us to be talking about community mediation, given the fact that you could probably come up with a cultural profile of the volunteers of this organization that would look almost nothing like sort of the general profile of so many of the communities that are out there. I'm just asking you to reflect on that, or
you don't have to ask me anything. That's a great reflection, and that's there's nothing unique about Chicago in this regard. This is, I think, the state of community mediation. Among the oldest organizations, of which you're one, this is still a very salient discussion and debate. So even where organizations can prove, even dramatically, that they have a very diverse volunteer profile, they have a very diverse staff profile, even those organizations will say that we've had very little luck over 20, 25, 30 years penetrating the communities where we feel, given our origins, our roots, and our aspirations, where we feel we should be working. And that has been very consistent in that discussion from place to place. And people over time resign themselves to something else, or come up with a variety of explanations for it, but it is pretty much, you know, the state of the field, I think. And community is a slippery concept. People make eloquent arguments that all the court work is reflective of community, and we can't divorce ourselves from community. That's why we do court work. It's fine. And some people say courts have nothing to do with communities, and we should be dealing with other people. And some programs for a number of years go in one direction and tell me they feel guilty and they're trying to go in another direction. It is a fact in most areas of the country that you have a very difficult time keeping your program afloat doing certain kinds of work in certain communities. That if that day has passed with local foundations, they don't find value in that work, you cannot sustain yourself doing that work. So at best, you need to come up with a balance. One type of activity that pays, and the other type of activity that you know will not generate any kind of revenues. talk about the balance. I haven't seen the balance. And I really only know of one organization which has, almost for 30 years, done only community stuff. And what happens to them doing it almost 30 years is that they are the only game in town working with the poor in conflict resolution. And everyone's got a little bit of a budget for the poor, and that's where they put it. So that's a stabilized budget. They do fine. Their offices are just above the welfare office in a Cleveland neighborhood, which they still serve. So but that's a radically different model than most of us have followed in all these years of court cases, et cetera. And they've always had a social justice mission, and they just kind of stuck it out. And but now have a monopoly over this kind of work with the poor, so they have money.
Now I want to talk to you for 3 more hours, but I want to respect the fact there are people who said around 1, so if anybody needs to go. And Harry, I know we have scheduled at 1:30 for he's doing a series of interviews, so we have a couple minutes if anybody wants to just come up to you and talk. And I wanted to thank you. This has been really,
Have you ever done a seat?
More cheese. Oh.
I don't know if they're still
Case.
They were doing CTA cases. Guilty of feeding, betraying, vandalism, whatever. Right, and the CTA would send representatives. CTA representatives would basically explain to the kids what the level of damage that they're causing is, how much it costs each time. And these kids are sitting there like open mouth. All I was doing was tagging. Right, I was just expressing myself. Exactly. Those were kind of cool. That actually seemed to have a pretty dramatic effect on most of the kids. Oh, really? Not certainly, you know, like a lot of
No, but I just respect the things.
Thank you. Nice to meet you.
They are really good. Oh, so there's no question. Incredibly good. It's so interesting, like doing the hands. I've always thought a lot about this issue. You can have a negotiated peace between the Palestinian authority and the Israeli government. That's not necessarily going to be a sustainable peace because you still have to find a way to control it. You have to be able to normalize the military. You have to give them an alternative. Like their whole life, these people, their whole lives has been tied up in the freedom or whatever they want to call it. And once there's nothing to fight for, they need something else to do. And their whole power, especially the leaders of these organizations, they have a tremendous amount of power, and they don't want to let go of their power. I think it was. It was. So what do you do? How do you normalize these groups if you're not including them in negotiations, if you're not providing any kind of economic infrastructure for their members to spin off normal jobs? What do you do? It's a fascinating question. It almost makes me feel like official negotiations are also a waste of time in a lot of ways. I mean, they're not a waste of time, but they're only a start.
Well, they also are very quick to reject. We've talked about this a million times, but you know, they are very knee-jerky in rejecting that, but doesn't fit their traditional. Ultimately, What? It's only me. You know what I mean? And so that, it makes it
But
hard.
even on the Israeli side,
So,
firm and even on the Israeli side, the new Israeli government
In some ways,
doesn't
You know, as I was saying,
and some of these radical communities in the West Bank, and Gaza before, but the West Bank still. So, you don't have all the parties at the table. That's the bottom line.
Some people think the marginalization.
Yeah.
you'd be amazed at how
Force them to the table.
it's not that amazing. Who said that the one part was
That was my experience.
Your kids see it.
Yeah, you know.
pushing out?
So he's still doing quite a bit of legal work.
Totally.
Sticking it out on
We need to have a fiesta of self-awareness or something like that. You know, I don't know what we got. Maybe a fiesta of facilitated self-awareness where we just.
You're gonna be around for a while.
Yeah.
How are you?
Yeah, for the rest of my life.
The rest of your life.
Yeah, I'm actually talking to you at 1:30.
1:30.
Can I come talk to you?
Absolutely. Yeah. You can before too, if you've got.
Oh, okay, yeah, let me do it in 5 minutes.
That's right.
No, I'm good.